We have Thijs Reuten, one of the co-hosting MEPs, to moderate it. He's also one of the people who's been working tirelessly on EU-China relations. So I will pass the floor on to him to introduce the different speakers and lead us through the discussion.
Seeing the pillar finally in front of the European Parliament and also the event there is that indeed, as was also said by Jens and by other speakers, the power of art is so immense, it's so big, because even without the pillar being visible, it has its influence, it plays its role in keeping us alert, but also in stimulating and encouraging the people in Hong Kong to not lose every faith and to not lose every hope for the future. And I think that is a big lesson to learn also from the connection between art and politics, between art and civil society. And I was sorry not to be able to speak at the introduction at the event, but if I would have gotten the chance to speak there, I would have said that this pillar also symbolizes for me that what the people of Hong Kong are asking is not the world there. It's not the world. They are only asking to have their civil rights respected and for a minimum guarantee of freedom. That is not a lot to ask. And I think that if that pillar, if the discussions of today and the coming days can at least foster us in continuing that struggle, in continuing also the fight side by side with the Hong Kong people, the Hong Kong diaspora, also in Europe and outside Europe, then I think we will continue, also with the help of Jens, to use the pillar as it was intended, and as it was meant when it was first erected in Hong Kong. So this discussion, the debate today comes at a very timely moment, now that we have had the passing of the new legislation, and this will lead to even more repression and silencing of people who dare to speak. And of course, we're all very worried about that. But that's ever the more reason that I'm so thrilled to have you all here and to have this debate today. So we, Kira, and the other MEPs are very grateful for that. So I will now ask the panelists to come and sit here.
In 1989, the world witnessed the millions of people on Tiananmen Square, but it wasn't just students, it wasn't just Tiananmen Square, it was Beijing everywhere. If you think about it, 2 million people in Hong Kong protest in 2019, June 12th. That's out of 7 million of people. In Beijing at that time, about the same proportion of people showed up to protest. And in Beijing, that means lots of people were government officials, government employees. That was the overwhelming support we got in Beijing. But overall, there were 400 cities in 1989 recorded protests. And so that was the most peaceful movement in China for freedom and democracy. Of course, that ended by Deng Xiaoping's brutal massacre with thousands of people killed with tanks, machine guns while the world was watching. I was put into prison, and many people, I would believe, well into 10,000 were arrested, sentenced all over the country simply for leading the protests. But immediately after that, there was widespread opposition party underground movement that was led by Hu Shigen, who was sentenced later around 92, 93 to about 15 years in prison, and there were many organizations like this. So this was the first wave of direct opposition. A lot of these were underground organizations, most people don't really know. By 1998, there was an open movement called the Opposition Party in the name of the China Democratic Party. So this was led by a combination of the students on Tiananmen Square and the previous generation, the democracy war movement. And I think over China, every province has at least dozens of people demanding registration as open, legitimate opposition party. This was before China joining WTO. People were trying to give the world a message that Chinese people want democracy in addition to free trade. But as a result, hundreds of people were arrested. Many were sentenced to more than 10 years in prison. This was little known to outside the world. At about the same time, Falun Gong practitioners started their own protest. So that is more visible today as probably the most organized Chinese resistance outside of China now. The Falun Gong practitioners, they started in 98, about the same time. So after that, after China joining WTO, there was a period between year 2000 and 2010. It was mostly the citizens movement, so led by Dr. Xu Zhiyu, the New Citizen Movement, and the Citizens Movement. There were also journalists who were active in different dimensions. There were also feminist group and labor activists. Each has their own demands and their own way. So this was kind of the most optimistic period, even though there wasn't a direct opposition. People were hopeful that civil society could change China. But by year 2010, after the Olympic in China, things changed definitely for the worse, especially after Xi Jinping took over. He cracked down on every dimension. We all know the lawyers. There was a crackdown on lawyers with hundreds being arrested and thousands on the banned list, exit ban. And I was involved in trying to rescue many of them with my organization, Humanitarian China. And after that, the journalists, the feminist groups, there was this group called the Feminist Five, and they were arrested simply for trying to stage a protest around the International Women's Day on March 8th, 2015. This got international attention, so international pressure worked, and they were released shortly. So this led to more awareness of the feminist movement that lasts till today. And at about the same time, a few years later, there were organized labor movements in Shenzhen, Jiashi. This was a factory that they were not treating the workers humanly, and the students from elite universities formed alliance with the workers to stage protest. And the Chinese government cracked down, even though the students believed they were true Marxists. They belonged to the Marxist clubs in China at that time. They were arrested, most of them disappeared now, probably after experiencing torture, prison in China. So this was the major movements before the White Paper movements. White Paper movements, I would call it Cloud Revolution 2.0. There was a similar movement like this in year 2011, what we call Jasmine Revolution in China. So this was inspired by the Arabian Spring. And at that time, so it was very different from the traditional movement in that it was started by an anonymous account on Twitter. Basically, it started by unknown source, but it was a consensus because there were a lot of movements outside of China. As a result, there were protests in major cities like Shanghai, Harbin, even Beijing. But many of these were unknown activists. As a result, CCP began to round up everyone on Twitter who has a follower greater than 10,000 followers. So these accounts, most of them, probably well into hundreds, were arrested. So the most famous one, Ai Weiwei.
Of course. Thank you so much. So again, Sarah Brooks, I'm the China Director for Amnesty International. And honestly, if I didn't know better, Fengsuo, I would have said you were reading my notes. Because precisely the historical arc that I think is so important to recognize when we look at freedom of expression, assembly, the ability to organize and push back against government repression does trace this path. And the only one I would add, and maybe I'll start here, is the 1226 incident, which I think, so this refers to a meeting among friends that was held on December 26th, 2019, and it was innocent. It was dinner. They talked about democracy. They shared some ideas. Subsequent to that meeting, all of the individuals involved were disappeared and detained for various lengths of time. In April of last year, so just under a year ago, 2 people who the state had portrayed as the ringleaders of this, Jin Jiaxi, a human rights lawyer, and Xu Zhiyong, a legal scholar who Fengsuo had mentioned, were sentenced respectively to 12 and 14 years in prison for inciting subversion. No, they were actually subverting state power, according to the judge, by having dinner together. And I start with this because I think it is such a clear example of the ways in which the understanding of the national security architecture in mainland China is so broad and so vague that having dinner together to discuss issues of human rights, democracy, can be seen as subversion of state power. We see this again in the indictment document of another human rights activist based out of Shanghai, Chen, who is accused in the document of meeting and accepting capacity building with foreign organizations. We see this with Huang Xueqin, who is a feminist activist detained before she was able to go to the UK to start her studies in 2021. And this is really crazy, right? So she's being accused of inciting subversion of state power for seeking to understand nonviolent civil disobedience, which you think is exactly the kind of work that a government who was confident, who was embracing its human rights obligations, would actually want to see from a civil society. But Xueqin remains in jail. She has had a trial. There has been no verdict released for her, nor Wang Jianbing was a labor activist associated with her. So I take that as a starting point and just want to kind of zoom out into what is this national security architecture that we talk about, and why is it important to understand that not only in the China context, but as we shift in our discussion and look at what is happening in Hong Kong today. So in 2015, actually just 9 days before the crackdown on human rights lawyers that Fengsuo mentioned, the Chinese government enacted a national security law. At the time, the High Commissioner for Human Rights said that this was an extraordinarily broad in scope. It was marked by vagueness in its terminology, and it left the door wide open to restrictions on human rights. We in Amnesty went further than that. We had sought to provide input into the drafting process, but when the law was enacted with none of the recommendations from us or any other organization that we had been in touch with, we called it virtually limitless in its scope. We viewed it as a blank check for the authorities to act with impunity to restrict human rights and fundamental freedoms. we see that that really set the stage for what happened next. What happened next was an anti-terrorism law that allowed the government to lock up people for religious expression. What happened next was a foreign NGO law, which has effectively cut off any ties, practical, financial, operational, or even personal, between organizations in the country and organizations working outside. We saw a cybersecurity law, which has embedded many of these principles and much of the law enforcement architecture into cyberspace. And I think that this is incredibly important because we need to understand this as a systemic approach to enabling a government to restrict freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and to stifle civil society organizations, to breach its international human rights law obligations. So if this sounds familiar, it may be because you have been following what is going on in Hong Kong, and one of the primary preoccupations of Amnesty International, among a whole range of issues that come up with the law, is one which I think is very fundamental, which is that we see Article 23 legislation as it has been adopted a handful of hours ago, as being a wholesale adoption of the mainland China approach to comprehensive national security. And if we understand and if we agree on the analysis of what we've seen and what Fengsuo and I have laid out in terms of shaping the landscape for activism within China over the last decade, we need to then understand what implications that has and can have as national security legislation drawing from that basis is implemented in Hong Kong.
Tusen tak, kære Vanat. Honorable members of European Parliament, dear friends, it has been almost 4 years since the implementation of the extraterritorial Hong Kong national security law. So as you rightly said, not only has the Hong Kong judicial system undergone drastic changes, but it also has permanent impacts on Hong Kong's British inherited autonomous institutions. Today I'm not going to be inspirational or giving any emotional speech. As a junior research fellow at Legal Borders, I would like to shed light on how the Chinese law has transformed governance, overridden Hong Kong jurisdiction, and essentially marginalized overseas judges in Hong Kong courts. And the first point I'd like to bring a point is how the national security law in Hong Kong as the new de facto governing body. The establishment of the Office for Safeguarding National Security in Hong Kong, and I shall refer it to the office, in July 2020 has changed Hong Kong's institutional settings permanently. As enshrined by the national security law, the office monitors and supervises Hong Kong government to fulfill its duty to safeguard China's national security. The office is not only coordinating with the Department of Justice of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Police Force directly for prosecution and enforcement of the national security law, but the office also coordinates with the second institution, the Committee for Safeguarding National Security in Hong Kong, and I shall refer to the Committee on National Security Matters. And in addition to this office, as the fourth Hong Kong-based Central People's Government Agency, the establishment of the National Security Committee has changed the leadership within Hong Kong government's executive branch. And I hope that you can follow that carefully. The committee, as I mentioned, functions as the main preparatory organ for national security work, as it mainly consists of the Hong Kong government's principal officials, the chief executive, or well known as the head of government of Hong Kong, the chief secretary for administration, the secretary for justice, and the financial secretary. So basically, the main leaders of the Hong Kong government is now being subordinated by the National Security Office. So the highlight of this institutional change is how the head of Chinese Liaison Office in Hong Kong, and I shall refer it to the Liaison Office, as the National Security Advisor to the committee. So now we have the office, the committee, and then the Chinese Liaison Office with three things. And as this liaison office serves as the representative of the Chinese State Council, in other words, the Chinese State Council is now directly part of the top decision-making body within the Hong Kong government. That's the first point. Secondly, I don't know how many of you have heard about China's claim on comprehensive jurisdiction over the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region many years ago. So in 2014, actually the China State Council released a white paper on the practice of one country, two systems, which highlights the Chinese claim of its comprehensive jurisdiction over all of Hong Kong. And within just 1 decade, this quote-unquote white paper has materialized in Hong Kong through the implementation of the national security law. And I think some of you might be familiarized with this problematic article number 55 to 56 of the national security law. The Hong Kong National Security Office can actually exercise its own jurisdiction over quote-unquote complex cases. And the Chinese Supreme People's Court will actually take over the prosecution process in this regard. And as it is the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, not the PRC mainland, who ratified the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And I think this removal of the national security cases from Hong Kong to the mainland of China may serve as a pretext for the Chinese authorities to ignore all the provisions of the international treaty, the ICCPR. And my final point is about other common law jurisdictions being marginalized. And I think it might not be an unusual fact to know that the presence of overseas judges from other common law jurisdictions at the Final Court of Appeal in Hong Kong has always been an element to acting as a legal firewall between Hong Kong and mainland China. And precisely because what the Article 44 of the National Security Law, the chief executive of Hong Kong has the power to designate judges to handle national security cases. And given what happened in the past few years about the patriotic oath requirement, a lot of overseas judges designated by the chief executive are not foreign judges. And such practice essentially marginalizes other judges from common law jurisdictions, for example, from New Zealand, from Canada, the UK, and you name it, to adjudicate the national security law in Hong Kong. So this is such a marginalization practice in which other common law jurisdictions are not actually improving Hong Kong's situation, but actually it's worsening the situation. And since this is an introductory remark, I will keep it short. And I hereby conclude that the People's Republic of China has extended both judicial and administrative jurisdictions over Hong Kong.
Yes, and that also brings us to today. It's a timely meeting, as you know, and as Sarah mentioned, Article 23 was passed by the Hong Kong Legislative Council around noon, just as we were unveiling the Pillar of Shame out in front of the European Parliament. And this is the Safeguarding National Security Bill, which is implemented under Article 23 of the Basic Law of Hong Kong, essentially their constitution, and it's referred to as Article 23. So on top of the national security law, as Iverson was talking about, this will prohibit 7 types of activities which the Hong Kong officials intend to consider offenses. The bill, like the national security law, includes vague provisions, and there are similar and overlapping provisions with the national security law that will essentially criminalize the peaceful exercise of rights and freedoms, which are protected under international law and bodies. Article 3 will bring further and severe consequences for the observation of human rights and the rule of law in Hong Kong, far beyond what we're already seeing happen with the national security law. Still, the Hong Kong officials claim that it is their constitutional duty to enact a domestic version of the national security law to safeguard the national security of Hong Kong, and they made clear their intention and directives from Beijing to do so as soon as possible. So even it happening today, none of us were exactly sure. We did expect it, but it was quite quick after less than a month and a half from when they first announced this. Yeah, the Hong Kong government also reported that 98.6% of the more than 13,000 submissions from the 1-month-long public consultation process support Article 23 legislation. This process started at the end of January and lasted 1 month, and it's obviously not likely that most of the submissions, North Korean-like reporting, support Article 23. And I have a feeling that our Hong Kong Watch's submission, which legally analyzed Article 23, as well as our joint statement condemning the bill that was signed by over 85 other civil society and human rights organizations, some of which are in this room, was not taken into account. When the Hong Kong authorities attempted to first introduce Article 23 in 2003, more than 500,000 Hong Kongers took to the streets to protest, and the plans were abandoned. Today, the Hong Kong people do not have a choice nor the right to protest without facing serious repercussions. We expect such repercussions to only worsen under Article 23, with specific concern to new restrictions which could ban an arrestee from speaking to a lawyer of their choice, extend detention without charge for up to 7 days, threaten freedom of religion or belief, similar to mainland China, and apply more severe penalties for activists abroad. Article 23 will also likely lead to a dramatic increase in the already increasing number of political prisoners in the city. Already, as Iverson was speaking about, the national security law has been a central part of Beijing's strategy to oppose the opposition in Hong Kong. More than 10,000 individuals have been arrested in protest-related cases and over 2,300 charged, with many detained or facing prosecution under the NSL and illegal assembly rules. Hong Kong's annual candlelight vigil commemorating the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre has ceased to exist. Multiple media outlets have been forced to close, including Jimmy Lai's leading pro-democracy newspaper, Apple Daily. Jimmy Lai, who is a British citizen, remains on trial today for 3 charges under the NSL, which carries a maximum punishment of life in prison. In response today to the passage of Article 23 and the national security law, parliamentarians, public figures, and civil society must unite to make it known that the legislation, which violates international laws and treaties such as the Sino-British Joint Declaration and different treaties under the United Nations, will not be tolerated. The international community, including the European Parliament, should urge the National People's Congress of the People's Republic of China to repeal the national security law, the Hong Kong government to cease prosecution of individuals charged with alleged offenses, and both Beijing and Hong Kong authorities to ensure legislation in Hong Kong is legal, legitimate, proportional, and in alignment with international human rights laws and standards. The European Parliament should also seriously consider introducing lifeboat schemes for Hong Kongers to enable them to flee from heightened repression, enact mechanisms to combat transnational repression, and review Hong Kong's special status in international fora, including the status of Hong Kong in economic and trade offices here in the EU. But yes, I look forward to discussing this more with all of you.
I'm one of the Exiled activists recently being appointed by the Hong Kong police. That's the Hong Kong police held a very high-profile press conference and announced that I'm with the bounty and for $1 million. And I think this is exactly to show the basic narratives back in mainland China that they try to incentivize to give you some reward of money, that you could betray to your friends, that they could giving the information relevant to those so-called criminal suspects in returns that you can get some benefits. And I think this values from China after 1978, definitely I think international community welcome China back to the international systems, back to WTO. But the thing is, what happens 35 years ago, like student protest, labor protest for democracy, it actually examine and prove when the people get certain freedoms, that they even ask more civil liberty. But actually afterwards it would have been suppressed. We need to take side to believe afterwards, when China is going to be more economically powerful, they could weaponize such muscle and exert a very aggressive authoritarian agenda to the world. So Hong Kong, as the status of international financial center, how it could be very successful is because based on the mutual trust between China and the rest of the world. And what happens after 2019 is actually when the establishments in the world need to listen to the voice of those grassroots community, the mass public, that they feel not only just within the society feeling not that equal, but also the main the main tool for the people to address such social injustice is about the people that have their votes, have their say in a very basic decision making, and to choose their political leader. And I think this is really important when Beijing make up the mind and saying, well, we previously promised you that we're gonna have one person, one vote, you have a universal suffrage. However, when they get more power, you're losing the bargaining power. Hong Kong as a status or international center, you're losing the bargaining power of economic, role model to China. They try to reshape a new international order, and actually, we need to think more about what's in the future. Meanwhile, international community welcome China back to engaging international community. They're replacing Taipei, becoming a permanent members of the Security Council in the United Nations, exerting influence, but bit by bit, gradually, that they try to reshape a new orders. And Hong Kong is one of very concrete example. As a Hong Kongers overseas in exile, we're living in the community, for example, in Britain, we actually trying to resettle. Not only that, we also hopefully could still maintain the narrative that for a third democracy, because the people staying in Hong Kong is getting less and less a chance to speak out. And I think now the exile movement, we need to overcome a very root cause problem, is that how could we stay relevant to what happenings in Hong Kong. We still have a kind of like a luxury or freedom that we could speak out, but also we need to engage with United Nations human rights systems, mechanisms, and it's really great opportunity to engage with the EU, to keep talking about what happens to Hong Kong and why that should be relevant, and also that's part of a very key domestic issue. For example, the Article 23 is going to be passed and will be effective very soon. This is actually a massive escalation, because it's not only just start targeting individuals, but they will start targeting the whole community. And they would instill the fear and chilling effects among all members within our community. Mistrust, fear, self-censorship, lots of things that's what's happening. This is actually about the mental trauma. It's really impacted within a society for long time, and it was still happening for the foreseeable future. And it gradually becoming a domestic issue, not only just about the tension between or within our Hong Kong diaspora community, but also the tension with the Chinese overseas, with also other locals. We never ever know who could be trusted, and we worry about lots of activities, not only just civilians or collect information for retaliations, but also the United Front activities. That's, China has great resources to do lots of cultural events, and then they actually monopolize all resources and power, that they are in a very better position to maintain a very civilized behavior externally, because they own power. And then they will gradually marginalize the activists in the grassroots, becoming very radicals, irrational emotion, and that is the thing, it's not equal for campaigning for democracy. It's really important how could we build up a counter-narrative to let all the people to know that Chinese people, Hong Kong people, what they're asking for is just a very fundamental human rights. It's nothing more than what China claims is anti-China, violent, or radical. So I think this is really important, and in the future, hopefully that our diaspora community could engage within international policy making or etc., and to let more politicians to know about this. And it's really sometimes we're in a very powerless position, because we're just a civilian organizations or NGO actors. But that is really closely relevant when we see Chinese regimes going to be more and more assertive, and that has some potential conflict could be happening in the future. And when we see that, is really what happens in Hong Kong will be the key. And it also testing the politicians around the world to make a right decision for the human rights and freedom.
I'm really concerned about what it is happening in Hong Kong, but regrettably, I need to tell you that it's not only in Hong Kong, because Macau, everything starts in Hong Kong and after come to Macau. And Macau will see this change on the law. I think that in the very near future will be in effect in Macau also. Unfortunately, people in Macau, they are not so vocal as you are in Hong Kong. Brave people, really brave people. But it's not enough to be acting on the ground. You need really support. And your support is also the support of our societies defending democracy, human rights, and freedoms. And by that, I'm really concerned, and this is one of the challenges that we are giving to the next mandate for colleagues that will be in the European Parliament. Follow the situation and clarify the relation between EU and EU member states and China. And we need really to be very, very clear on this. Human rights are universal and indivisible. So, nobody is allowed to violate human rights. And China don't has a special status in what is the debate of human rights. The other topic is how to protect the people that is on the ground fighting for freedom, human rights and democracy. One of the questions is to grant humanitarian visas for these people, of course. But it's not enough. And we know very well what it is happening in our countries. 13 countries with overseas police stations in these countries. The majority of them in Spain, very near my country, but and in my country we have an investigation undergoing on that topic, and also in Italy the majority. So we need to be very strong in the answer to this, and we can't cope with this. This is a major violation of also our commitment with human rights. This must be clear. The extradition treaties must be abolished in all our countries. And my country is one of the countries that has an extradition treaty. As you know, by the historical condition, by the historical relations, and also by the relation with the Macau territory. So, but we need to be very clear and finished with these treaties. And we need also to be very clear in our economic and trade relations. Europe needs to have a strategic autonomy, much more and more and more. And we need to be very strong because the answer, it will come. My country is already facing the answers. I'm threatened of being judged by this not so new law in Macau, because it was only the revision of law. The law was already ongoing, but I'm threatened of being judged in absentia and have a request of extradition to my country, to the territory. So it will be funny, but it's not so funny, because this shows us how proud and how arrogant these people is and how they behave. And as my country is not conceding conditions for the 5G, Now we don't need it till now visa to enter in Chinese territory, and now we will need the visa to enter in Chinese territory. And this is something that show how they play, but we need to be strong, united in European Union, because this needs really a united answer, because I'm sure, and it's not needed to be very clever or an expert in relations with China to understand that, of course, Mr. Xi will try to divide us, and is already doing that. He's already doing that with the investment in some of our countries, the dependence of some of our countries, and so on and so on and so on. So we need to have a real strategical view to deal with China and to deal with all these problems, and also to support the civil society inside China, inside the mainland, because we can't forget what it is happening with Uyghur community, what it is happening with the Tibetan community, what it is happening with the minorities, religious minorities, and so on. And we need to have a strategy for one side, to support civil society, and from the other side, a clear view and a strategy to deal with China, and to tell to China and Mr. Xi that the international commitments are to be respected till the end, and he's not respecting the joint declaration, Sino-British declaration, and the joint Sino-Portuguese declaration, and of course the international law is for everybody, and no one is out. We are all in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel. Yes, please. Feel free if you need to go, but please stay with us if you can. Next colleague from the European Parliament, ECR group from Poland, Anna Fotygya. Please, your first remarks in response.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I must say that after all these presentations, and I'm quite long in this topic, I start to think about bigger issues actually, and I follow Isabel's remarks about our attitude to the PRC. Are we really willing to consider PRC still a systemic rival? Only a systemic rival. Let me start with experience of my region, including my country, Poland. We had changes in Poland exactly when Tiananmen massacre happened. So the first partially free elections after communist or dismantling communist rule in Poland happened on 4th of June 1989, exactly. Why probably I pay so much attention to PRC, to fate of Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau as well, is because at that time I was simply engaged in foreign department of Solidarność, and therefore focusing a lot on human rights. So probably I was slightly more vigilant personally. But when I listened during this panel to statements about this dinner, actually it reminds me all stories of my grandparents, parents, friends about Stalinist time. It is well known in our countries, and it belongs to totalitarian regime. So what kind of trade relationship what kind of division between, let's say, human rights dialogue and eventual engagement, believing in step-by-step changes, whatever. In my opinion, with this kind, we have eventually to sit and reassess once and for quite a long time our policies. Also, because of challenges of, let's say, last 2 years. We used, in my region, we used somehow to perceive PRC like kind of within the bloc of antidotum for domination of the Soviet Union, in particular in Romania, but also remember that talks between US and PRC, China, happened in Warsaw. So there were this kind of niches for different perception of threats also coming from this. But now, after this declaration between Putin and Xi Jinping on 4th of February, if I remember well, of 2022, just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and enumerating actually areas of cooperation, we may speak about eventual trying to decouple, but I think that consolidation of the non-Western bloc or countries, autocratic countries having or showing the aggressive posture, being it Russia, PRC, North Korea, Iran, simply step by step deepens. And in my opinion, the key to solve the situation is in very clear attitude and understanding that we have very hostile action against all of us. Of course, we have to enumerate, and I'm part of Hong Kong Watch within the European Parliament. I already signed protests against Article 23. I know what steps to take in order to ease in real-time situation of those who are subjects to intimidation in Hong Kong. But unfortunately, the problem is bigger, and we have to face it sooner or later. Whether it is possible to engage with perpetrators of genocide, or to think it is possible somehow to by means of dialogue to change this situation. We in the European Parliament denominated the Hitler's Nazi Germany and Stalin's Bolshevik Soviet Union as totalitarian criminal regimes. After all these years, but in real time in Poland, we were absolutely sure, vis-à-vis both regimes, what it was about and whether it was possible to engage with such regimes. Thank you.
Megan, can you while I will look around for people who want to make remarks, can you elaborate a little bit on how important, from your perspective, it is that approaching the 35th anniversary of the crackdown on the protest, how important it is that we still in 24 try to keep the memory, the commemoration of Tiananmen alive. What does it mean taking inspiration from the activists back then, but also the ones that we have now with us today? What does it mean for you?
Yeah, of course. Along with commemorating the Tiananmen Square massacre, I think for Article 23, we were curious as to why they were passing it today specifically or this year. And listening to the Hong Kong Legislative Council this morning in their debate, they were actually saying that this year is the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st. And so they had it as the top priority in Hong Kong this year to pass Article 23. So between that, as well as the 35th anniversary commemorating the Tiananmen Square massacre, I think the biggest thing for the Hong Kong community, the international community, civil society organizations, and then also parliamentarians, is sending the message that Hong Kong is not completely gone, that there's still a fight to be had, especially for human rights. And especially what activists are doing abroad in the UK. Obviously, there's already 160,000 more than Hongkongers who have relocated. Simon's leading one of the largest grassroots organization, and they're quite active. But I think from the EU over here, it's also ensuring, whether it's through the suspension of extradition treaties or introducing lifeboat policies, that the activists that are abroad and that are keeping the memory through events like we have today, that they're able to do what they do without fear.
And thank you so much. Let me move to the audience. I have a question there, I have Jens, and I have you. So we take 3 questions and then we go back to the panel. Please, introduce yourself. And
Hi, my name is Nick Williams. I'm from Index and Censorship. And this is a question really for Iverson and Simon. We've been looking at a lot of the sort of transnational repression, obviously China, but you obviously see Rwanda, Iran, and other countries. And that places a responsibility on host countries, so the US, Estonia, and the UK. And in the UK, we've seen attacks against protesters in embassy or consular grounds. What do you think, and with MEPs in the room as well, what do you think European states should do to ensure that they can protect Hong Kongers or anyone from China who's living in exile, and what more needs to be done to protect?
excellent question. Let's wait for a moment because we take the question also from Jens.
You have China has attacked us 2 times because of this meeting, and it was a different way they do that. They have to take me a lot of time. Every time I make something, then they make him speak like that. But this time they had 2 times talk about one country, 2 system, and like a good thing. We defend one country, 2 system, and I was wondering why they do that so much, because everything they do now, this is one country and one system. Is because are they afraid to some trial or something like to take them to court to break the rule, or what happened? Why are they talking so much about one country and 2 system when everything they do they smash the 2 systems? I can't understand it. I have really hard to understand what China is thinking, but maybe explain something about it.
Very good question. I wrote it down. We will not forget about it. But third comment, yes. And then we go back to the panel. Please.
Yeah, my name is Lyndon. I'm reporting for Voice of America. So my question is mainly about Taiwan. So how do you suggest the European Parliament to engage with Taiwan to battle with China's influence in terms of like trade, in terms of national security here? Like what do you suggest, especially MEP and all the panelists, we should do as international community to move on to the next stage to embrace another possibly war coming?
Okay, excellent. I wrote down the questions, and to Iverson and Simon, I will give you the floor to dive into the question on the host countries, what to do about the transnational repression, and what, well, it's particularly dear to my heart as well because I'm very active in the Netherlands on this topic, and I think we can simply not accept that foreign powers are actually doing their business on our soil. That is basically what it is. But you can tell from real experience what it means to have constantly have to look over your shoulder. So please, maybe you can respond first, Simon, to the question from the audience.
I think in the case of Estonia, because it is a small country of 1.3 million people, in terms of China scores, I'm just speaking more from an academic perspective, that we have, let's say, less than a dozen of China specialists in the country. So I think the biggest concern right now is that what is the blacklist about within the Chinese embassy in Tallinn, that a lot of China scholars actually, well, except me, of course, I can't go to China. I'm talking about Estonian citizens who look into the Chinese affairs, that they're afraid that they will be being too critical against China, and therefore they would be on the blacklist and they cannot visit China. I think the long-term concern here is that if they have blocked most of the Estonian citizens who look into China's affairs, then no one can actually understand China from the Estonian perspective. Then essentially there wouldn't be a decent Estonian foreign policy on China. So I think what the Estonian government can do right now is to use and utilize this a diplomatic channel in Beijing. The Estonian diplomats in Beijing need to raise in every occasion to guarantee the safety and the access from the Estonian citizens to visit China freely without any hindrance, and to conduct academic activities. I know that it may sound very optimistic, but then I think it is definitely very crucial, because from what I understand is that more than a decade ago, I think there was a case, was an Estonian citizen who was very vocal for Tibet, and he was banned from visiting China. But then after some years, for some medical reasons, he was allowed to visit China for a conference again. So I don't think this is impossible to achieve. It's not impossible as an ask to guarantee all the Estonian citizens to visit China freely to conduct academic activities. And I think the Estonian government has the right and duty to raise its diplomatic tools in order to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon?
Okay, I think this question is quite commonly discussed in the UK. But also I think that's really difficult to handle it, because that's we always in the dilemma, when such kind of detentions, that we worry about the massive civilians, but it's really difficult to get evidence. And in terms of the rule of law, that's you need to accumulate enough chains of evidence to make sure that there are informants, there's the spy, and how to prove the persecution that is actually derived from the actors within the UK jurisdiction. But I think it's something that it could be done. First of all, is the concept that need to be promoted, like transnational repression. Even what I heard is mostly from the US. In the UK, I very barely heard about these terms. They try to prefer to put this into the hate crime, or for example, when I've been targeted by a bunch of WeChat users. We cannot verify where they're actually living. We only could say that's WeChat user. That's they try to hunt me down to get my personal address. And I report to the police. They categorize it as malicious communication. I think that is also concern, how can we deal with it? That is a systematic challenges and persecution, and we also don't want to help to solve the fear within our community, distrust within our community, and also the overreaction that to some British Chinese community. So this is really difficult. What I'm saying is, that is legitimate concern. But I think we need more time. For example, back in Hong Kong, if there's more evidence that will be tabled on the court, that if there's any informants that be recruited within the UK, there's more chance that we could present to the UK government to do more things. The recent updated National Security Act within the UK, and also proposing the foreign agent registration, I think it will be really delicate balance that you make sure you have your own rights you have your freedom of expression to say you're speaking for the Chinese government, but you need to be honest. That's to let people know how to prepare the risk factor.
Zhou, you want to come in on this?
I have worked extensively with the college students from China, both in American and in European countries. I think there's a lot we can learn from what the United States has done successfully. FBI arrested quite a few who fit into the same category as these people who threaten the activists simply for posting opinion against the CCP. So one such person was convicted 2 accounts, which could lead to each 5 years in prison, which in the past could be dismissed as speech. Now, because it has concrete, direct injury to the people, to the target, and I think that's a big step ahead in the United States. Also, very recently, we are working on with U.S. Congress this TikTok law, which in the past a lot of people argue wrongly on the basis of free speech. Here we are talking about a rivalry country who has all the intention of overthrowing the very order, the universal value we live in. So they cannot be granted this freedom to operate in the United States or in European countries. I think that legislation passed with overwhelming majority in the House. We hope it will go through the Senate and go into law. I think there's a lot we can learn from that. So I think so on that, United States.
As an example.
That's a good example. And of course, here I think we, these host countries needs to be proactive in reaching out to the Chinese diaspora community who are vocal in their voice against the CCP, and I have worked with them. There's lots of such organizations here. Also, we need to give them stage. So I also want to answer the question about Taiwan. I think I recently visited Taiwan, leading a group of 20 young activists from all over the world who are originally from China to visit Taiwan. We are all so encouraged by Chinese-speaking democracy, and I think the legitimacy of the government in Taiwan is beyond doubt. Right? It's elected in a very robust liberal democracy that was consistently ranked #1 in Asia now. But such a country, it's not a country. I mean, it doesn't have any status diplomatically. It's a shame of the international community not to treat Taiwan as an equal partner in the international stage. For example, before the pandemic broke out, I was in Taiwan. We were talking about the pandemic in Wuhan, which was developing. So Taiwan has the best knowledge of it, but Taiwan was excluded from WHO. There is no way WHO could benefit from it. I think this is wrong. We should rectify it. Democratic countries should establish full diplomatic relationship with Taiwan.
Thank you. And now Anna also wanted to come in on the transnational repression and on Taiwan.
Thank you. On transnational repression, we have at least 2 very powerful countries that openly pursue the policy of extraterritorial intimidation, even killing of their opponents. One is Russia, remember Skripal and earlier cases, Salisbury, and how we reacted to this. And also we have, of course, it is very difficult to gather evidence, individual evidence, because these are usually operational, I would say, issues. So necessary to engage quite extensive state apparatus. Although Estonia has excellent one, having option 0 after communist time, but still it is a small country, and we have, once more I return to my first statement, should we reconsider the, let's say, systemic rival we have to deal with, and be consequent. We may discuss how to engage, how to follow US. You know that very difficult, being size and power of Estonia, to follow US with whole might of this country. Even with consolidated eventual powers of the EU, it is slightly difficult with variety of policies engaged. First, we have to put proper diagnosis. In terms of Taiwan, I think that it's not so bad with European Parliament policies since, well, for quite a long time already, there is quite considerable number of MEPs who tend to engage with Taiwan and step by step pushing for deeper engagement of EU and EU member states with Taiwan. For some of us, there is kind of tradition as well. For a certain time, Taiwan used to be acknowledged as a state by some international actors. I think that reports of the European Parliament are very, very proper, and resolutions voted with a vast majority of votes over political divisions. There is economic engagement. I think that changes after a full-scale invasion, in particular knowledge about necessity to engage in Taiwan, obtaining certain supplies, because supply chains have been disrupted during the war. There is a lot of necessities we have that help us in enhancing relationship between EU and Taiwan, EU member states and Taiwan. In my country, all this time, even in 1989, it was Taiwan's office and still is. So this relationship, although not acknowledging not the statehood of Taiwan, relationship is there. You know our reaction to situation of Lithuania. So there are mechanisms we try to introduce in order to prevent pressure being exerted by PRC on even smallest EU member states. So I think step by step, but there is a progress on the level of European Parliament, and I'm sure that it is going also to influence the Council and other institutions.
Well, for sure there is a lot of irritation in China in the PRC about it, so that's a good sign. I think we have still the daunting question by Jens on the one country, two systems. Maybe Sarah, are you tempted by responding to it?
I was going to put Megan on the spot.
Megan.
You're actually even more expert. But I maybe can add a little bit just on generally Chinese government narratives.
Well, to refresh everyone's mind, Jens, if I correctly rephrased him, was asking, okay, this one country, two systems thing has been presented always as something, oh yeah, that's great, look, sounds good. Well, over to you.
I mean, my initial thoughts in response are that the Chinese Communist Party, if anything, always wants to save face, so particularly when it comes to Hong Kong, and the idea being that it would be one country under two systems, or one country, two systems under the Sino-British Joint Declaration after the handover in '97. I think that they would do everything they can in the public perception to ensure that it would be 50 years until 2047. Obviously, we know that's not the case as early as the National Security Law of 2020, even before that, now with Article 23 today. But they do this not only with the one country, two systems framework, but also with a lot of the structures in Hong Kong. So they still want it to, if there is an independent judiciary when there no longer is, lots of the judges are appointed. The only positions in Hong Kong that can now be elected are technically the district councillors, but that's been reduced from 488 to 72 seats, and most of those are also fixed. So I think from maybe if you have more on the mainland China side, but I would think that they'll do anything they can for the general public perception and on paper to be that it is one country, two systems, even though that obviously is not the case. I think it's riding a lot of party lines, and also if President Xi Jinping ever had to answer to that, at least then they could say, oh, well, in theory, or it is one country, two systems, even though it's not.
Sarah.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And in 2021, Amnesty put out a very short document, which is What China Says, What China Means, alongside actually a slightly more robust version called the Decoding China Dictionary, which was headed up by scholars primarily at Raoul Wallenberg. Both of these are such important examples of, I think, how we understand what China articulates and the language it uses and the way that it wishes to present concepts, contrasted with what the actual substance and meaning, comport and intent of those words are. And so that's just a resource I would point you to. I think another thing, often from Amnesty's perspective, we are looking at this in the multilateral sphere, in the UN, and it's incredibly clear that China does seek to portray itself as playing by the rules, as being a responsible leader, as upholding true multilateralism. And when we dig into that, I think is really when we start to see the cracks emerge. A particular bugbear of mine, I'll just conclude on this one really quickly, is China's regular framing of itself as an ally to the global south, as anti-colonial, as a member of the G77, of course, global south group within the UN. Very happy to point a finger at some, fair point, deeply problematic post-colonial scenarios around the world, but at the same time, entirely willing to reinvigorate colonial era sedition laws in Hong Kong after they had been in the cabinet for 50 years. So I think this type of double standard, this type of hypocrisy is something that's really important to be able to pull out and to make visible when we see this.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's really important question. Like CCP or very typical totalitarian regime always say something very paradoxical. I mean, for example, one country, two system. I think from their perspective, when they focus more about national sovereignty, that they highlight one country. And when they highlight two systems, the main purpose is that they try to restore the confidence with the elite classes for business. That is also in the benefits with the Chinese regime. Because when they're doing business with the West, they actually build up echelons of the elites, that they have a common ground, that they take benefits from it, and that they also need to buy the support gradually from them to keep supporting the status quo. That is also in the interest of the CCP regime. So that is really important, I think. when do you see recently Hong Kong government launched a campaign to say normalizing the situation, organize lots of extravagance, that they say is back to normal, introducing more financial experts that coming back to Hong Kong, pretending that is running the business as usual. And secondly, I think they try to pretend still that they are a very responsible international player. So when they're engaging within international law, paradoxically and ironically, they still claim national security law is complying with ICCPR, complying with UN human rights, and saying you need to make sure that people have a safe environment. That's why they need to impose this law, suppressive law, to make sure other human rights could be protected. So this is really, really interesting when we talk about totalitarian regime. All the things would be included, even every bright word, they would be included. So I always explain that totalitarian regimes like a black hole, they could even absorb the light.
To advise the European Union on the best way to impose sanctions.
Yes, I do think, so on the US side, I know that sanctions is actually at the top of their response list on the policy side towards the US government. On the UK side, we're also still pushing for targeted sanctions against Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee. And in the EU, they've also yet to sanction anyone. But I think the most effective way, at least from a Hong Kong Watch standpoint, is to have targeted sanctions and to at least start at the top with John Lee. Because at this point, I don't think John Lee is turning from his position or anything happening. There are formal channels in the EU that you have to go through. When someone's sanctioned the EU, you can't ever essentially take it back. So targeted sanctions definitely would be a response to this. And I also just want to respond as well. I know you said that the Hong Kong authorities were trying to catch international government bodies off guard. And while 12 days is not a sufficient amount of time to go through a 212-page draft bill, we actually did respond today. I think the number is probably now, since I've been sitting here, over 80, but 80 international parliamentarians and public figures from the European Parliament, from the US Congress, from the Canadian Parliament, and then also like in Malaysia, South Korea, and Singapore, and I feel like I'm forgetting someone. Oh, and in the UK, that has the most number of signatories. I came from London as well, but they did respond, and we've also gotten a lot of feedback already from the European Parliament, but also on the UK side that they're already putting out written parliamentary questions, calling for debates. So even though the Hong Kong authorities did this today and it was quite rushed, I do think that there was time to prepare, whether it was statements, and I do think that actions will be taken, and I think targeted sanctions is on the list as well. So if that's helpful, yeah.
Anyone else? This, Anna?
I think that in terms of Hong Kong, punishing those directly responsible for perpetrators, simply being it judges or chief executive or other people responsible for violence against people, ordinary citizens, may be effective, and it is important to put it in place. But I honestly doubt same measures taken against the PRC, because there we have a totalitarian state, and actually it is whole system engaged in this, so it makes a problem. I think that we have to consider a different type of sanctions and other measures.
Yeah, I'm the moderator, but I'm also a member of the European Parliament. And we did actually call on previous occasions, but in the context of the Uyghurs, for sanctions up to the highest level, meaning, of course, if he doesn't understand, meaning, of course, Xi Jinping as well. But I think that one of the lessons we also should learn, also from today, because today we are also seeing a picture upholding some kind of fiction that we, with our brains, translate into democracy.
That's right.
Because if we see people raising their hands, we have a automatic reaction that it has to do something with democracy. As the same with last weekend's so-called elections in Russia. When we hear that, we have a feeling that it has to do something with democracy. And the thing I think maybe that we need to learn these lessons a bit faster, but also remember them a bit longer. Because this is not the first time that we are put with this lesson when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to China. So I think that my biggest regret really is, and I think that should also be the lesson that we have to learn, is that we did not respond when there was actually the first breach of the Sino-UK agreement. Because then when an autocrat has done something and nobody responds, and we do another step. So that is, I think, the lesson we need to learn as Democrats, not like overreacting or German, but simply learn the lesson that you have to respond immediately and draw a line, because an autocrat will never stop by itself. We together as democratic forces have to do that. And we are confronted with that also today in a very poignant way in the war of aggression